Why do we even need weapons? Was the first question I asked when my supervisor went through the protocols by name. The room is empty, right? It's in case someone tries to enter or leave the room, he answered calmly. Just follow instructions and everything will be fine. I was assigned with Mark to guard an empty room in a storage facility in a small town for his work. The room had appeared out of nowhere one day, and since then, only 3 people had entered, all of whom had died within minutes during their short visit to the room. There was a camera installed during their brief visit that provided constant live feed, allowing us to observe the room. Although nothing had ever been seen, there was always a dark atmosphere surrounding the place, as if something was off. The walls were made of an unidentified metal, and the door had no clear way of opening. It would open by itself, whether touched or not. However, our orders were simple. Keep people out of the room. The room was monitored 24 hours a day by one of the 3 teams. While the work outside was dull, it paid enough to ensure we didn't ask too many questions. We only had to contact the team leader, Dr. Henderson, if any activity was recorded in the room, whether it was actual movement or just sounds heard through the door. Apart from that, we were left to our own devices, usually just chatting and passing the time. Occasionally, we would hear sounds coming from behind the door. To me, it sounded like a distorted music box playing an old tune, one I remembered from my mother listening to it years ago. Additionally, I could hear someone softly sobbing, the familiar yet distant sound of an old woman crying. Mark, on the other hand, always claimed it was a laughing boy. Though he wasn't sure who it was, he said the sound also felt eerily familiar. However, the cameras never showed anything. We only contacted the team leader if we heard anything, as instructed. He always responded with extreme disinterest. "Who cares who's making the sounds?" he'd say. "As long as the screen remains blank. Just keep your eyes open and let me know if anything changes." Years went by. The metal door separating us from unknown horrors always remained untouched, and as far as we were concerned, it would never change. We followed orders, got paid, and that was it, at least until we heard someone knocking on the other side of the door. "Hello, please let me out. I don't want to be alone anymore," the voice of an older woman pleaded. It sounded like the same woman I had heard crying for years. The melody of that cursed music box continued to play in the background. These 2 facts truly made me think of my mother, which was impossible since she had passed away years earlier. "Did you hear that?" I asked Mark, who was also fascinated by the sound. "Yes," he barely replied. "I'll call the doctor. He needs to hear this," I said, as I tapped the touch messages on the blank screen. I picked up the emergency phone and pressed 1, activating the alarm that immediately alerted the team leader. We had gone through the procedure enough times to make it a routine event, but this time was different. Despite the sounds we had heard over the years, no one had ever knocked on the door before. "Oh God, this can't be happening," I heard Mark say in the background. I turned around and saw that he was pale, his face covered in sweat, his eyes fixed on the screen. I took a few steps closer to make sure my eyes weren't deceiving me. There was something in the room. At first, I couldn't see exactly what it was. It looked like a poorly formed chair, as if someone who had never seen furniture before had been tasked with assembling chairs. And on top of it lay a music box. Before we could discuss what had appeared in the room, Dr. Henderson entered the storage space with a tired expression on his face. "Report," he said as he greeted us. "There's something in the room," I tried to explain, before the knocking on the door silenced me. The knocking seemed to wake the doctor up a bit. After catching a glimpse of the live feed, he suddenly stood still in shock. No, he muttered, almost to himself. "Close the door." With that, the image on the screen was replaced by static, whatever was in the room disrupting the connection. "Let me out. It's so cold in here," I heard the voice say through the door. I could see the doctor becoming increasingly nervous. All color drained from his face, and beads of sweat formed on his forehead. He picked up his own phone, ready to call for backup. but just like the live feed, the phone refused to work. "Hey, Doc, what's going on?" I asked, finally speaking up. Meanwhile, Mark hadn't said a word yet. He just stood there, mesmerized by the screen full of static. "You two, stay here," stuttered the doctor as he rushed out of the building, continuously trying to call for help with his broken phone. Once he was gone, I exchanged a quick glance with Mark before a new noise caught our attention, banging on the door. "Do you see him?" "Silence." He nodded as if you were talking about him. "It's Alexander. It's my son," he said. "Your son who went missing 7 years ago?" I asked, expecting the answer. "I have to get him out," he said, his voice tinged with panic. He rushed to the door, trying to figure out how to open it. "Mark, wait," I called out, but he ignored me. When he couldn't find a way to open the door from underneath, he prepared to kick it in. "Stop," I yelled, aiming my gun. "Please, he's trapped in there," Mark begged. "It doesn't make sense, Mark. Your son is dead. How could he be in that room?" I pleaded, but his words were strange, emotionless, as if they weren't his own. "Let me handle this, please," I urged. Surprisingly, he complied with my request. I needed to get him away from the door. Although I wasn't keen on tying him up, there was a closet around the corner where I could lock him up. "Just take a few steps back and come with me," I said cautiously. He nodded without protest, and I began to relax slightly. Lowering my gun, I gestured for him to step away from the door. As he turned around, before I could react, he picked up a chair and threw it at my head. One of the legs struck me in the eye, and I fell to the ground. As I groaned in pain, Mark seized his opportunity and pounced on me, swiftly hitting me with his own gun. When I regained my senses, I found myself bound to the same chair he had thrown earlier. I didn't even know where he had gotten those tie wraps, but they held me firmly against the wall. "I won't do this," I protested weakly. "The doctor will be back any moment with help." Meanwhile, the knocking had turned into pounding, a desperate voice screaming for release. Tears streamed down Mark's face, but his words carried no emotion. Again, he attempted to open the door, this time simply touching it, and the door swung open on the other side, revealing the darkness beyond. After the emptiness, the music box stopped playing, and the woman pleading for freedom fell silent. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice heavy with regret, as he stepped into the violently vacuous room. Then he vanished, and the void poured out of the chamber into the rest of the storage space. The light that had filled my surroundings was swallowed by the ever-growing darkness. As it passed me, I felt the temperature drop to freezing, every sound in the room muffled. "Mark!" I called out from my still-bound position, hoping for a response, but I was met with absolute silence. I sat there in the eerie stillness, hoping the doctor would return with reinforcements. I could barely see a meter in front of me. I was sure something was moving in the room. Only vague shapes came through the door, accompanied by wet footsteps heading in my direction. I dared not make a sound, but I was gone, replaced by a sickening metallic odor in the air. I quietly tried to free myself from the chair, but the tie wraps held tight. All I could do was hold my breath as dozens of silhouettes passed by, and the footsteps gradually faded away. Minutes passed, and I heard the wet footsteps slowly recede. It felt as if the creatures had left the room, but the darkness lingered. Still, not a millimeter moved until I saw the room flood with flashlights. The doctor rushed in with a dozen guards, all armed with strange, heavy weapons. They quickly cleared the room and positioned themselves in front of the open door, leading to the void that Mark had disappeared into. "Oh, God," muttered the doctor as he approached. Henderson was the one who untied me. His face was bruised, but I was otherwise unharmed. "What the hell happened?" he demanded to know. "It was Mark. He went into the room," my boss said, looking into the camera feed. I followed his gaze to the weapons the guards were holding. They weren't typical guns. Instead, they shot powerful blue beams that pierced the void and pushed the creatures into the corners. Finally, we caught a glimpse of what was actually happening inside. There, I saw hundreds of pieces of broken flesh scattered across the floor, walls, and ceiling. They defied gravity, covering every available surface with bloody chunks mixed with fragments of clothing, making it easy enough to identify the amalgamated body. It was Mark. Then I saw something that immediately made me vomit on the floor, a piece of flesh with an eye. Though it was absolutely impossible, the eye flashed with panic through the room, blinking and reacting to light. It was alive and attached to a part of his mouth, moving in strange directions as if trying to scream, but failing to form a sound. Then we saw a piece of his still beating heart, and I saw muscle tissue desperately trying to move limbs that weren't there. "Close the room now," ordered the doctor, but disbelief still lingered. "He's still alive," I said, still not believing it. "He chose to go in. Do you want to suffer the same fate?" The guards closed the door without a word and began affixing metal plates to it. Part of me wondered why they hadn't done that immediately, but I couldn't bring myself to ask them. "Did anything leave the room?" my boss asked me, snapping me out of my daze. "No," I replied. The team secured the area and set up posts with guards and cameras aimed at the door, but I feared the damage had already been done. Whatever existed within that room was far beyond the rules of our own reality, and now they were free. "What do we do now?" I finally asked, feeling a little more composed. "We'll have to kill everyone in the village," my boss said. And that was the end of this creepypasta. Thanks for listening, and until next time.